At the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone Rivers, in a place with no city name and no address, a gate opened most mornings to the sound of several languages at once. By the early 1830s, families were arriving on foot and on horseback, carrying tanned buffalo robes folded over their shoulders, sacks of corn, dried meat, and bundles of beaver pelts still carrying the smell of the trap lines. Some had traveled for days. Assiniboine families came most often. It was, in fact, at their request that this post had been built in the first place. Mandan and Hidatsa families came from Earth Lodge villages downriver, bringing produce their communities had grown for generations. Crow, Cree, and Blackfeet visitors passed through as well, each carrying different customs, different expectations, and different words for the same object being traded. Inside the walls waited another kind of diversity. American clerks stood alongside French-Canadian traders and Scottish company men who did not always share a language with each other, let alone with the people arriving at the gate. This was Fort Union, a wooden palisade roughly 200 feet on each side, with stone bastions rising at two corners, a flagstaff at its center, and a reputation, within a few years, as the grandest trading post on the upper Missouri. It was not a military fort. No soldiers were stationed here to enforce anything. It was something stranger and, in some ways, more fragile. A commercial outpost where survival depended entirely on people who did not speak the same language, finding a way to trust one another anyway. So how did it actually work? How did a Hidatsa farmer, and a Assiniboine hunter, and a Scottish company clerk agree on the value of a buffalo robe, a length of cloth, or a pound of beads, without a shared vocabulary for any of it? The answer was not simply barter. It was not simply exchange. It depended on people whose names rarely appear in company ledgers, interpreters, many of them Indigenous women married to traders who carried entire negotiations on their shoulders. It depended on households that were neither fully American nor fully Assiniboine or Mandan or Hidatsa, but something new, built inside the walls of a trading post that existed for one purpose: commerce, and ended up becoming something else as well: a home. This was not the empty frontier of popular imagination, waiting to be filled. It was already full of trade routes, kinship networks, negotiated languages, and daily decisions that shaped who ate, who profited, and who held power in a relationship that was never quite equal, even when it worked. By the middle of the 1830s, the fur trade itself was shifting. Beaver, once the currency of the entire business, was losing value in distant markets that Fort Union's residents would never see. Buffalo robes were taking its place, arriving by the tens of thousands each year. And underneath that shift sat a harder question that every family inside these walls, on both sides of the counter, understood without needing to say it aloud. This arrangement was useful, even necessary. But it was also the leading edge of something larger moving west, and it would not stay the same for long. This is the story of what happened inside those walls. One trade, one meal, one marriage, one season at a time. To understand what happened inside Fort Union, it helps to first understand why it existed at all, and who asked for it. In 1828, the American Fur Company, under the direction of trader Kenneth Mackenzie, built this post near the junction of the Missouri and Yellowstone Rivers. The location was not chosen only for its access to beaver-rich streams. It was built, in large part, because the Assiniboine Nation had requested it, seeking a reliable trading partner in a region where competition among nations for hunting grounds and trade routes was already intense. This detail matters. Fort Union was not simply imposed on the landscape. It was, from its very founding, a negotiated presence, shaped by Indigenous initiative as much as by American commercial ambition. Within a few years, the post had grown into a square wooden compound, roughly 220 by 240 feet, its palisade walls whitewashed, its roofs painted a deep red that made it visible from a considerable distance across the plains. Two stone bastions rose at opposite corners, not to defend against organized attack, but to project stability and permanence in a landscape where neither could be taken for granted. A single gate on the river-facing side served as the main entrance for traders, wagons, and the steady traffic of indigenous visitors who came to do business. Inside, the buildings told their own story about who lived here and how. Along the western side of the courtyard stood a long structure that housed the sleeping quarters for company employees, clerks, craftsmen, laborers. Facing it stood the retail store and stockroom, the beating commercial heart of the post. Separate from both stood the bourgeois' house, home to the post's manager, where important visitors, European nobility, artists, naturalists passing through the region, were received and lodged. By the early 1830s, this was not a small operation. At its peak, Fort Union employed close to 200 people, and a detail often left out of popular accounts. Roughly half of the fort's total population, when women and children were counted, was indigenous or of mixed indigenous and European descent. This was not a fortress of American men holding a defensive line. It was, demographically, closer to a mixed community, one where native women and their children made up more of daily life inside these walls than the traders who get remembered in company records. That detail leads directly into the question the title of this episode promises to answer. How did trade actually happen here, in practice, between people who often did not share a language? Picture the scene at the gate on a typical morning. A Hidatsa family arrives from an Earth Lodge village along the Missouri, carrying corn, beans, and squash, grown in the fertile bottomland their community had farmed for generations, produce the fort's employees depended on to supplement a diet otherwise heavy in dried meat. An Assiniboine hunting party arrives separately, bringing tanned buffalo robes, work that had taken weeks of scraping, stretching, and smoking hides using techniques passed down through generations of women's labor. Beaver pelts, still valuable but declining in importance, as European fashion shifted from beaver felt hats to silk, come in smaller bundles from trappers working the surrounding rivers. None of these visitors spoke English as a first language. Few of the company's traders spoke Assiniboine, Mandan, or Hidatsa fluently, and yet, trade needed to happen, reliably, fairly enough to keep relationships intact, and often within a single afternoon. This is where the person history books tend to overlook enters the story, the interpreter. At Fort Union and across trading posts of the upper Missouri fur trade more broadly, many of the most essential interpreters were indigenous women who had married company traders in unions known at the time as marriage à la façon du pays, marriage in the custom of the country. These were not casual arrangements. They were recognized, socially significant unions that created bonds of kinship between trading companies and the nations whose territory and cooperation the trade depended on. A woman in this position did far more than translate vocabulary. She carried cultural context that no phrasebook could offer. She understood what counted as a fair opening offer among her own people, what tone would cause offense, which relative accompanying a trading party held real decision-making authority, and how to phrase a company man's blunt commercial language in a way that would not insult a visiting hunter or elder. When a Blackfeet or Crow trading party arrived, speaking neither English nor the language of the fort's other indigenous residents, these women, some fluent across multiple indigenous languages in addition to French or English, often became the only bridge available. Their labor rarely appears in the company's ledgers, which tracked pelts, robes, and manufactured goods with far more care than they tracked the people who made those exchanges possible. But without this work, the fort's central business simply could not function. Step inside the retail store itself, and the physical reality of trade becomes visible. Shelves and counters held glass beads in a range of colors and sizes, imported from manufacturers as far away as Europe. Wool blankets, prized for warmth in a climate of brutal winters, sat stacked near bolts of printed cotton cloth, calico, a fabric that quickly became valued for clothing across many indigenous communities of the region. Metal goods filled another section, iron kettles and cookware that replaced or supplemented traditional ceramic and hide vessels, knives, awls, and tools that reduced labor in tasks from hide preparation to food preparation. Firearms and ammunition occupied a controlled, carefully managed portion of the inventory, valuable, dangerous, and central to both hunting and to the balance of power between rival nations in the region. Tobacco and pipes, items with deep ceremonial as well as social significance, were part of nearly every transaction, often exchanged first as a gesture of goodwill before formal bargaining even began. The negotiation itself was rarely a single moment of haggling. It was closer to a structured social event. A trading party might be welcomed into the reception area, offered tobacco, seated according to status, and engaged in conversation, mediated, again, often by an interpreter, before any goods changed hands. Rank and relationship mattered enormously. A respected hunter or a family connected by marriage to a company trader could expect different treatment than an unfamiliar visitor from a nation the post had less established ties with. Value itself was not fixed the way a modern price tag suggests. The worth of a buffalo robe in glass beads, in cloth, or in ammunition shifted based on the season, the volume of robes already in the fort's stores, the relationship between the specific trading party and specific traders, and increasingly, over the course of the 1830s, based on terms that grew less favorable to indigenous traders as the American Fur Company's position in the region solidified. This is a detail worth sitting with because it complicates any picture of Fort Union as a simple space of equal exchange. The relationships built here were often genuine. The commerce was frequently mutually beneficial in the short term, but the terms of that commerce were shifting gradually in favor of the company, a pattern that would only accelerate in the decades to come. By the time a transaction concluded, robes and pelts had been counted, inspected, and moved toward the fort's storage areas, destined for the long river journey downstream to St. Louis. In return, a family walked back through the gate, carrying cloth, tools, and goods that would shape their household's daily life for months, alongside kinship ties, debts, and expectations that would shape the next visit as well. Trade was only one layer of what happened inside Fort Union's walls. Beneath the ledgers and the counters, everyday life was unfolding, and it looked very different from the popular image of a fur trading post as a purely male, purely commercial space. Consider the bourgeois' house, home to the post's manager and his family. Visiting accounts from the period describe a household that insisted on certain markers of what its residents considered civilized order, even 1,800 miles upriver from St. Louis. A table set with white linen, butter and milk served alongside meals, seating arranged by rank, with the bourgeois himself at the head of the table. This was not incidental. For a man managing a remote commercial outpost, maintaining these rituals was a way of asserting that Fort Union was not a frontier improvisation, but a stable, permanent institution, a message aimed as much at company investors and visiting dignitaries as at anyone else. But step outside the bourgeois' house, into the long residential buildings along the palisade walls, and a different domestic reality appears. Company employees, clerks, craftsmen, laborers, interpreters, often lived in single-room dwellings, sometimes housing more than one family at a time. Many of these households were built around marriages between company men and indigenous women, Assiniboine, Mandan, Hidatsa, Cree, and others, unions that, as already noted, were recognized as legitimate and socially significant within the fort's community, even if American law elsewhere in the country would not have recognized them the same way. These were not simply convenient arrangements for the men involved. For indigenous women, marriage to a trader could offer access to manufactured goods, a degree of protection, and elevated status within both communities. For their families and nations, these marriages created durable alliances. A woman's kin network became, in effect, a channel of trust and preferential treatment between her community and the fort. And for the children born of these unions, life took shape in a cultural space that was neither fully American nor fully Assiniboine, Mandan, or Hidatsa, but something distinct, a mixed community that some historical accounts describe as its own developing culture, with its own customs of language, dress, and daily practice. The labor inside these households deserves particular attention because it is often the part left out of both romanticized and purely commercial retellings of fur trade history. Processing a buffalo hide into a usable robe was not a brief task. It required scraping the hide clean of flesh and fat, stretching and staking it to dry, then working animal brains or fat into the surface over repeated sessions to soften and cure it, a process that could take days of sustained physical labor. This work fell overwhelmingly to Indigenous women, whose skill and labor were, in practical terms, the foundation of the entire buffalo robe trade that Fort Union depended on for its profitability. Without this labor, the finished robes that filled company ledgers simply would not have existed. Beyond hide work, women inside the fort's walls were often responsible for preparing pemmican, a dense, long-lasting food made from dried, pounded meat mixed with rendered fat, sometimes with berries added, a staple that helped sustain the fort's population, including its non-Indigenous employees, through winter months when fresh food was scarce. They gathered and prepared other food as well, managed households that might include children from more than one relationship, and, as already discussed, frequently carried out the demanding, high-stakes work of interpretation during trade negotiations. None of this labor appears prominently in the American Fur Company's official records, which tracked pelts, robes, and merchandise with precision, but rarely documented the people, disproportionately women, whose daily work made the entire operation function. This is a pattern worth naming directly because it shapes how the story of Fort Union has often been told, as a story about traders and company men, with Indigenous women present mainly as background figures, when in practice they were central to nearly every function of the post, economic, diplomatic, and domestic. It's also worth pausing on who exactly was arriving at Fort Union's gates, because native visitors were never a single group with a single set of customs. Assiniboine communities, whose request had led to the fort's founding, were people of the northern plains, historically more mobile, organized around hunting bands that followed buffalo herds across a wide territory. Mandan and Hidatsa communities, by contrast, were agricultural peoples who lived in substantial, permanent, earth lodge villages along the Missouri River, cultivating corn, beans, and squash in the fertile floodplain, a way of life with deep roots in the region long before Fort Union's walls went up. These were not interchangeable identities. Their languages differed. Their forms of housing differed. A detailed visual reconstructions must respect carefully, since Mandan and Hidatsa communities are frequently, and inaccurately, depicted in plain-style teepees, rather than the earth lodges that were actually central to their village life. Their relationships with the fort and with each other carried their own histories of alliance and rivalry that predated any American commercial presence in the region. Crow, Cree, Blackfeet, and Ojibwa trading parties also made their way to Fort Union at various points, each bringing distinct languages, customs, and expectations. For the fort's traders, this meant that no single interpreter, no single set of customs, and no single approach to negotiation could cover every relationship the post depended on. Fort Union's success rested on managing multiple, simultaneous, culturally distinct relationships, not on treating native trade as one uniform system. By the mid-1830s, the balance underlying all of this was beginning to shift in ways that would matter enormously in the years ahead. Beaver pelts, once the trade's most valuable commodity, were declining in worth as European hat fashion moved from beaver felt towards silk. In response, the trade in tanned buffalo robes grew rapidly. The fort was, by some accounts, moving more than 25,000 robes downriver in a single year, alongside roughly $100,000 in merchandise sales, figures that made Fort Union the most profitable post on the upper Missouri. This growth came with a cost that was not always visible in the moment. As the American Fur Company's position strengthened, the terms it offered Indigenous trading partners often grew less generous. Debt became a recurring feature of the relationship, with some families and hunting parties owing goods against furs not yet delivered, a system that could quietly erode the independence of trading partners even as it kept commerce flowing smoothly on the surface. And underneath all of it sat a reality that both sides understood, even if it went unspoken in daily transactions. Fort Union's presence, however peaceful and however mutually useful in the short term, was also part of a larger pattern of American commercial and territorial expansion moving steadily westward. The relationships built here, through trade, through marriage, through years of shared meals and shared labor, were genuine, but they existed inside a larger structure that was not, in the end, designed to preserve Indigenous independence. That tension did not announce itself loudly in the 1830s. It simply sat quietly beneath every counter, every negotiation, and every household inside these walls. So how did two or more cultures, without a shared language, manage to negotiate, live alongside one another, and even build families in the same space? The answer was never simple, and it was never one-sided. It depended on interpreters, often Indigenous women whose names rarely survive in company records, but whose knowledge of language, custom, and kinship made trade possible at all. It depended on marriages that created real bonds of alliance and trust between nations and companies, even as those same marriages existed within a system that would ultimately serve American commercial interests more than Indigenous ones. It depended on labor, the scraping and curing of hides, the pounding of pemmican, the raising of children in households that belonged fully to no single culture, much of it performed by women whose work sustained the entire post and whose contributions have too often been left out of the story. Fort Union was not empty land waiting for history to arrive. It was already full of Assiniboine hunting bands and Mandan and Hidatsa farming villages, full of established trade routes and rivalries, full of people making daily decisions about survival, trust, and profit, long before an American company built a wooden palisade at the river's edge. What that palisade added was not history itself, but one more thread woven into a pattern that already existed. Another set of relationships, another set of dependencies, another set of pressures that would only intensify in the decades that followed, as disease, treaties, and further expansion reshaped the upper Missouri in ways the families trading here in the 1830s could not yet fully see. To ask how people lived at Fort Union is not to ask one question. It is to ask who was Assiniboine and who was Hidatsa, who was a company clerk from Scotland, and who was born inside these walls to parents from two different worlds, who profited from a season's trade and who quietly fell into debt because of it. The fort's walls held all of these realities at once: genuine cooperation and real inequality, shared meals and unequal terms, a functioning community, and the leading edge of a much larger transformation still to come. If this helped you see the American frontier differently, not as an empty stage, but as a place already full of nations, languages, and relationships, subscribe to Inside 19th Century America. Like the video, and let us know in the comments which trading post, which nation, or which region of the fur trade would you like us to explore next.